Ask yourself this question. Why is Russia so afraid of Ukraine joining NATO? NATO has never attacked Russia, and no NATO member has ever expressed any desire to invade Russia. And even if they did, there is nothing within the NATO treaty that would compel any other NATO member to join them if they did. So what are they afraid of? Why are they afraid of a collective defense treaty? It's got nothing to do with US military bases on their border. There are already 4 NATO members that share direct land borders with Russia that have US military bases and have done so for decades. And even then, there is nothing within the NATO treaty that compels anyone to have a US military base on their soil. A third of NATO members have absolutely no US military presence whatsoever. And there are 33 non-NATO member countries around the world that do have US military bases. Russia being afraid of NATO is like being afraid of your neighbours because they just put locks on their doors. Why does Russia care if their neighbours have a collective security guarantee? Nothing more than a promise that we will come and help you if someone tries to destroy you. Quite simply, with NATO comes security. And with security comes confidence for nations that have spent centuries under Russian control and influence to rid themselves of that influence. This is why Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland have developed stable democracies and their people have found prosperity that has been quite simply denied to other former Soviet countries. Meanwhile, the people of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and Belarus, they all know that it's the Russians that choose who run their country, and it's done on terms that are favourable to Russia. They know that the liberties and the wealth of the Western world will not be tolerated within the Russian sphere of influence because that means Russian power would be rejected. Remember in 2022 when mass protests emerged in Kazakhstan against the pro-Kremlin regime? It was Russian troops that entered the country and suppressed those protests and ensured the ongoing security of the regime. Remember when Georgia seriously talked about joining the European Union? Within weeks, Russian troops were on the outskirts of Tbilisi. And in 2014, the Ukrainian people voted in a president based on the promise that he would lead the country to EU membership. And that president would end up having private talks with Putin and then would suddenly change his mind and change the policy and instead signed an agreement with Russia, forging closer economic ties between the two countries and rejecting the EU. The Ukrainian people knew what this meant. They knew who their president was working for, so they took to the streets. For months, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in the freezing cold of winter, 109 civilians were killed by the president's security forces until eventually the president was forced to step down and he fled in a helicopter to Moscow. And then the Ukrainian people voted in this guy, the first candidate who wasn't part of that former communist political elite, a charismatic, pro-Western, anti-corruption president. Zelensky posed an existential threat to Russia's control of Ukraine. His anti-corruption crusades would erode the power of the oligarchs, who basically worked as proxies for the Russians. His democratic reforms would see the country build these democratic institutions that allowed Poland and the Baltic states to break free from Russian control. Russia had 2 options: allow one of its colonies to liberate themselves from its grip, or to put their fist down. And we know which one they chose. And just ask yourself the question, if NATO expansion is all about US imperial ambition, how come it's the Ukraine that is begging to join and it's the US that is saying no? And they're not asking for much. They're not asking for us to fight for them. They're just asking for us to promise that we will if Russia tries to destroy them, because they know that that's enough, that promise, that Russia is terrified of that promise. Well, at least they used to be. Because that promise used to be underwritten by the strongest military force the world had ever known. It used to be. Putin knows that war with NATO would be fatal, possibly for everyone, and as malevolent as he is, he remains rational. Russia will never attack a NATO country so long as the USA is a member of NATO. The Ukrainians are just begging. After fighting for their freedom since 2014, after hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have died, after countless civilian deaths in near nightly airstrikes, will NATO protect them if they stop fighting? Will they have the opportunity to get to their feet and rebuild their nation? Can they free themselves of Russian corruption and influence without the fear of repercussion? And all that Trump and his MAGA crew can say is stop resisting. It'll hurt less that way.